Thank you, everyone. Tonight, I am pleased to welcome José Aragüez to our ongoing argument series. José is Adjunct Professor of Architecture at Columbia University and a PhD candidate in the History and Theory of Architecture at Princeton University. He holds a diploma in Architecture and Urbanism from the University of Granada and a master's degree and graduate certificate in Advanced Architectural Research from GSAPP here at Columbia University. He has presented his work internationally across Europe, North America, and in the Middle East. Tonight, José will present The Building, an ongoing research project that seeks to focus our attention on key architectural questions, to open up new areas of inquiry, and to expand the relevancy of our discipline to other fields. Under his leadership, this project has yielded 2 symposia, a seminar, and a book published by Lars Müller Publishers in 2016. The book brings together the writings of 43 contributors, including architects, historians, theorists, and philosophers, who offer incisive case studies of buildings designed and built in the United States, Europe, and Asia in the last 25 years. Describing the agenda of his book in the introduction, he writes, quote, "This volume suggests ways in which buildings can trigger conceptual frameworks whose influence extends beyond architecture into other domains of knowledge and practice. Such domains include cultural and intellectual history, philosophy, literary theory, the city, the arts, and design at large." So please join me in giving José a warm welcome. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Alex, for your introduction, and Enrique for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here. Okay, so I'm gonna dive right in. As Alex just said, although you see it now as a book, this is actually a multi-year, self-initiated, larger discursive project that we started in 2014 with the co-organization of 2 symposia, one at the AA in June and the second one at Columbia University, co-organized with Aaron White, who's in the audience today. So that was the first phase of the project. Then second phase of the project, seminar I taught at Cornell, 2015. Third phase, the book itself, that came out in November last year, 2016. And then the fourth phase, a series of lectures and panel discussion events that are taking place throughout 2017 across the US in the spring and across Europe in the fall, to kind of not so much as book launch events, but actually to assess the outcome of the project and to keep fostering the conversation around its agenda. So the whole enterprise started with a rather simple diagnosis. I was a PhD student at the time, for second year, and as I was becoming more and more fascinated by the kind of intellectual expansion that I was being exposed to, at the same time, it became more and more apparent to me that there wasn't a lot of discussion on architectural design in scholarly circles in architecture. So, in other words, that there wasn't a lot of architecture in architecture. I don't know, maybe it was me. So I started sharing this diagnosis with a number of colleagues, faculty, etc., and actually everybody seemed to agree with it. That means there was a repressed quality to the issue, right? So let's bring it to the surface, right? Let's gather historians, theorists, PhD candidates, along with architects themselves, to discuss that which is supposed to establish a common ground for everybody, which is architectural thinking as a form of knowledge. So that was the beginning of the project. So I brought here a number of pictures from the 2 symposia. This is the one that took place at the AA, where you see John McMorrow, Tom Weaver, Adrian Forti, Mario Carpo, Mark Cousins, Marina Laturi, Brett Steele. So pretty much everybody was there. It was kind of a seminar-like type of event with heated conversations, sort of old-style British approach. Versus the one at Columbia, which was more sort of conference-like. You see that actually the GSAPP logo wasn't even updated. That was 2014. So both myself and Enrique, just a tiny bit younger at the time. A little bit less gray hair, just 10% less gray hair, 20% less gray hair. And other people like Stan with a handmade diagram. Some of the round table, you see like Michael Meredith, Aaron, Jorge Otero, Amanda Risa Lawrence, Bernard, who happened to be in the audience just as Aaron was presenting his very building, and you see Joan Ackman, Silvia Levin, Alejandro Zarapolo, Michael Young, etc., etc. And then lastly, I brought also some pictures of the events that have taken place after publication of the book. So you see, you get a bit of a sense as to the kind of scope of the project afterwards. So this is at the Lisbon Architecture Triennale last December with André Tavares. This is with Lars here in New York in February. This is MIT with Amanda, again, Michael Hayes, Rafi Siegel, Anna Miljacki, and Brian Norwood. This is just 3 months ago here, GSAPP with Bernard, Stan, Amal, and Jorge. This is University of Illinois, Chicago, Bob Somo, Sean Keller, Joe McMorrow, Penelope Dean, and Tom Kelly. And the last one actually we did in LA a couple of weeks ago, but I didn't get a picture of that for that yet. So, okay, so I'm going to jump into the second part, which is, well, just briefly mention that we are expecting that by the end of this year, 2017, around 400 people will have either participated or helped with the project in its different phases since we started it in about late 2013. So we're very happy with that, the impact. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share a number of propositions that underpin the theoretical armature for the project. And I'm going to do it just very quickly, so I don't take very long, just without elaborating on them, but rather kind of articulating them. So first, regardless of how many agents, layers of discourse, or multiple aspects you bring into focus, the building remains a necessary condition for a contribution to knowledge in architecture, right? So you can write about or reflect upon animal species, bills and rental agreements, communities, drawings, whatnot, but those things will only be relevant to architecture if they are related to a building of some sort, whether the building is in the foreground or in the background, right? Now, that necessary condition would be different if instead of architecture, we'd be talking about furniture design, installation design, exhibition design, or a number of other fields within the designed world, right? At the same time, outside of design, the necessary condition would be different if instead of architecture, we'd be talking about biology, politics, metaphysics, religion, ethics, and so on and so forth. Now, this distinction among fields is important, and it's actually a prerequisite for two reasons. One is obvious, because you gotta have two different things so that you can actually establish a relationship between them, right? That's a platitude. But then, more importantly, because you actually should be able to account for the differences of those fields so that the intersections that can occur between the two fields are actually productive, right? So otherwise it will be hard to reach an accurate understanding of the interdisciplinary processes that you're after, that you're producing. So in other words, whereas when interdisciplinarity is on the table, usually you emphasize the zones of overlap and so on, actually I think you could argue that interdisciplinary processes are first and foremost rooted in difference. Now, as a result of the so-called theoretical standard of the 1960s, which is actually a larger phenomenon that cut across the humanities, architectural history and theory began to establish relationships with other non-disciplinary structures and social realms, such as psychology, philosophy, sociology, anthropology, etc., through the use of so-called mediatory concepts, right? So concepts that belonged in those other fields, such as reification, signified, ideology, deconstruction, rhizome, etc. Right? So that is how importing concepts from those other fields and applying theoretical frameworks external to architecture started to become a pattern, right? A pattern that I would argue is still dominant today. Right? Now, in parallel to that dynamic, a tendency that we can call the building as, which is that starting perhaps a little bit later, around the mid-70s, the status of the architectural object, and by object, and I want to kind of specify this a little bit further, I don't mean that buildings are object in the empirical sense of the term, that is, a self-contained reality with clear-cut defined boundaries, but actually just architecture's object of study. Right? The building as architecture's object of study, not that the building is necessarily an object, as in an empirical object. Right? All right, so starting in the mid-70s, the object grew more and more unstable, as it appeared in more and more guises. So to give you some examples, the building as the reification of power structures, the building as a facilitator of participatory processes, the building as the locus of phenomenological content, the building as a catalyst for investigating the psychology of perception, the building as, right? So now, this diversification is actually a good thing, right? There is an index for the increasing sophistication of architectural history and theory, which we enjoy today, to be sure. Now, the issue here is that the flip side of that tendency is that the object itself, again, the building as architecture's object of study, emerges as a medium through which to tap into concerns that belong to other fields, actually fields other than architecture, more often than as itself a realm of research. Right? It emerges more often as a medium through which to access other fields rather than as itself a realm of research, right? If not as altogether absent, right? So sometimes it's actually altogether absent. So it is only in this sense that perhaps the more kind of polemical claim of the project that you could argue that the object has primarily been a means rather than an end in architectural history and theory over the past 5 decades. So based on this diagnosis, this project attempts to balance out those two trends a little bit, right? Not to overturn them, right? Because again, they're good, actually. They're very good. But just to balance them out a little bit. So in order to do that, it sets up a twofold agenda, right? So on the one hand, to discuss what it means for a building to embody a historically significant contribution in terms of a design aspect or a concept relevant to the reading of buildings in general, right? So in other words, to go from focusing on the building as to also work on the building, right? And then secondly, to more ambitiously, to even venture ways in which buildings themselves can trigger concepts, terms, and theoretical frameworks whose impact might actually extend beyond architecture into other domains of knowledge and practice. So, in other words, for that tendency to import to begin to coexist with architecture's capacity to also export to the outside. So, in other words, the book appeals to architecture's specificity in order to expand its limits and audiences, rather than withdrawing into its own autonomy, right? And here's where, for the first time, appears this distinction between specificity and autonomy that we're going to take a few steps towards before actually discussing in a little more depth. So, proceeding to that, first thing is to say a building is not form, right? At the very least, the building is not only form. It's a combination of form and program, right? And if those terms make you a little uncomfortable, you could say that, well, a building is something like a three-dimensional material construct made up of elements and relationships between them, we would typically call form, that is established in such a way that can house a set of human activities, right? What we typically call program, let's say at least over the past 20 or 30 years, although Barry Bergdahl actually mentioned to me that as early as 1815, the term program as such actually appeared already in some French briefs for architecture, right? So it's actually not such a recent term, or as recent as we would think it is, right? So central to the building's nature is also the spatial organization articulated within its boundaries, as well as the design processes leading up to it. So typological operations, contextual conjectures, construction, and so on and so forth. Now, in architecture, it is particularly important to distinguish between discursive and representational knowledge, right? Now, if this was a lecture on metaphysics and this was a school of philosophy as opposed to school of architecture, that would be a little bit reductive. But for our purposes, this is valid, I think, which is to say, let's use the term discursive in its classical sense. So the kind of knowledge that involves premises, narratives, judgment, inferences, concepts, ideas, and so on, as they are channeled through thought and expressed through language, right? Channeled through thought and expressed through language. Now, that is different from representational knowledge, which we use a lot in architecture, given its nature, which is the kind that proceeds through images, drawings, and models, mainly, right? So, as the building is a book and not a building, actually, or a design, its target is discursive knowledge, right? That's what it seeks to make a contribution in. Which is not to say that many authors in the book actually use representational models, that is, images, drawings, and models to be able to produce or to use them as mediums to produce discursive knowledge. Right? All right, so then we can say this is established that architectural thinking is basically understood here as the practice of producing discursive knowledge, right? Discursive knowledge through the analysis, discussion, and conceptualization of aspects of two inextricably bound regimes. The regime of the design process, right, which we might call architectural design thinking as a subset of architectural thinking, and the regime of the outcome of such a process, that is to say, the building itself. Right? So, practice of producing discursive knowledge through analysis, discussion, and conceptualization of design process and building. Right? Now, if that is the case, then architectural thinking is definitely a distinct domain of discursive knowledge whose attributes reach well beyond form and aesthetics. And I'm not going to elaborate on this. Maybe we can talk about it during the discussion. But it's particularly important to emphasize this idea that architectural thinking or the building is not only form and aesthetics in an American context as opposed to other contexts for a number of historical developments. Right? So many of those attributes, I would argue, are directly related to ontology, technology, and several modes of logic and phenomenology. Now, this sounds a bit too philosophical, but I just wanted to put it out there to kind of emphasize the idea of architectural thinking being specific, distinct, but at the same time, not only formal or aesthetic. Okay, so now we are ready to discuss this issue of specificity and autonomy, right? So again, I can elaborate, but basically, maybe you guys have already discussed the question of autonomy, the Italian branch, the American branch, different, actually, rather different, both of them, but having something in common, right? Which is an impulse to reduce architecture to a kind of itselfness rooted in the essence of form, right? Which is meant to create a kind of hermetically sealed, right? So that's why they use terms such as immanent or self-referential system out of that reduction, which is meant to fall outside of time, right? So to reduce architecture to a formal system that is meant to fall outside of time, right? Now, why is architectural thinking not autonomous, and why is a focus on the building not autonomous? Well, first and foremost, because architecture is not only form, right? Definitely not only form, and autonomy is all about form, right? Then second, because architectural thinking may or may not search for timelessness and universals, right? It's certainly a methodological option, and it can be pursued, but it does not need to be pursued of necessity. It's not built into the nature of the form of knowledge, right? And then third, architectural thinking is not some closed-off epistemological field, right? If such a thing were possible, which actually many people argue that's not even possible, no matter how you compartmentalized human knowledge, right? It's rather connected to other fields outside of architecture and to culture at large, right? At the same time, however, architectural thinking is a specific domain. Now, why is it specific? Well, simply because the processes involved in the design of a building and the characteristics of the outcome exhibit a number of particularities, right, that distinguish them, that make them clearly different from those leading to a piece of music, a film, a piece of literature, a painting, etc., notwithstanding the analogies that you can establish between those mediums a posteriori. Right? That's why I think you could argue it is definitely a specific domain. So based on that, what this project attempts to do is to combine specificity and non-autonomy and pursue a kind of engagement where the building is now turned into the main object of research and recast to be able to produce concepts, terms, and theoretical frameworks that could potentially become meaningfully relevant to fields outside of architecture. So, in other words, and this is perhaps one of the key phrases in the project, it tries to produce architecturally specific yet generalizable knowledge. Right? Specific and yet generalizable, grounded in the specificities of architectural thinking and at the same time applicable outside the boundaries of the discipline. Right? Okay, so I'm going to run quickly through the structure of the book. The 6 terms under which the 30 case studies presented in the book were grouped under were chosen deliberately for being at once directly related to architecture, but at the same time elemental enough to be pertinent to fields outside of architecture, so that they could function as heuristic devices to access those external fields. Right? So what you find is a number of case studies where topics are discussed that are both intradisciplinary and extradisciplinary. Right? So basically, the book has these 3 sections: 30 case studies, buildings built or designed within the last 25 years, so contemporary architecture, through which the authors were asked to tackle the twofold agenda that I explained earlier. Right? Then, second phase, second section, longer critical essays, where authors in question reflect on the problem of architectural thinking as a form of knowledge, partly through reflections on the rest of materials in the book. So the conversation is kept going actually within the pages of the book. And then third, 5 shorter essays assessing the importance of this renewed interest in the building in the context of architectural education today. Okay, so that's the first part of the presentation. Now, the more kind of theoretical part. Now, less theoretical part. I'm going to just share with you guys 5 examples from the book where the authors speak to the first part of the agenda, and then another 5 where they speak to the second part of the agenda. So this is actually one of the essays that you guys read for today, Penelope Dean on Fujimoto's Any House. She makes a number of arguments as to why this building embodies this historically significant contribution in design. So very quickly, one of the things she says is that here Fujimoto evacuates the wall. I mean, she relates the building back to Adolf Loos's ground plan and says, well, what happens here is that he evacuates the wall from Adolf Loos's ground plan and thus creates a platform plan. Right? So embodied in a particular lineage and then sort of described in terms of a contribution to that historical lineage. Then second, for example, she says, well, the floor slabs become so small that actually they approximate the scale of furniture and even to the point that they become furniture, right? So another specific contribution right there. And then third, she mentioned in the context of modern architecture, she says, well, actually modern architects discarded the room, right, in their pursuit of the open plan, discarded the room only to reinstate the spatial dividers in different forms, right? So here what happens, according to her, is the exact opposite, that the organizational principle of the room is kept, but the vertical divider is gone and actually replaced with the horizontal offset between the different platforms. Right? The second question, this case is from AA, writing about Ensemble Studios Truffle House. He says that this building was not designed, but actually what was prescribed was his construction process to escape the strict rules of design representation or design through representation. So usually, if you're not familiar with it, basically the way it was built is you dig up a hole in the earth, fill it up with hay, then pour concrete around it, remove the earth, have a calf eat away at the hay so as to create the interior, and then punch a hole which becomes a window. Right? So that was the construction process. Usually when you have a concrete project, you try to elaborate, to kind of design the cast to minimize the risk that inevitably comes with concrete construction. Also here, there is a kind of intentional roughness to the technique, which is used to introduce uncertainty as opposed to certainty. In other words, again, the cast is used to introduce unpredictability as opposed to a clear one-to-one relationship between design and outcome. The third, John McMorrow, writing about the MVRDB Expo 2000 Dutch Pavilion, he argues that this building enacts a modification of an existing diagram, the 1909 theorem, as identified by Rancujas in Delirious, New York. So the 1901 theorem, which you see on the right, is basically this image of this huge, massive steel structure supporting suburban plots, right? which Rem reads into the New York skyscraper as the possibility of stacking independent plots within the same building. Right? So John says that in the delirious version of the 1909 theorem, there was a kind of semantic and environmental autonomy that was privileged, insofar as every floor was completely independent from the one above and the one below. Whereas what happens here in MVRDV's building is that the separation between floors is reconsidered in terms of how they function ecologically. Right? So, the surpluses and deficiencies of one floor in terms of air, heat, light, water, etc., become utilized on another. So the heat giving off of one floor is used to cool the next, and the water flows through, etc. Right? So what happens is that there is what used to be autonomous is here reconnected ecologically, and thus the structure materializes, according to him, a principle of interconnection through separation and integration. With Sendai, which is an example that you all know, I'm sure very well, this is a case of a free plan where you have skin, plates, and tubes, so same as Maison Domino, except that here the normal columns are substituted for these hollow structural elements made up of very thin tubes, which are capable of wrapping vertical systems and circulation. Right? So that's exactly where the contribution lies relative to the lineage of the Maison Domino. And last, Marc Fauchot from ETH, writing on Sana's Rolex Center, here the argument is that it is in the management of thresholds that the contribution lies, exactly. Right? So what happens here is that there was a need for a programmatic fusion between spaces for verbal exchange with spaces for total silence. Right? So if you need this fusion, then you have to actually get rid of the walls and then replace them with 18 arches in pretension, a floating screed, and a carpet that enable these long topographical thresholds that articulate different soundscapes within the building. Right? So you end up with these horizons within the building that acts as though they were partitions, even though there are actually no partitions. On top of that, there is a kind of more or less ingenious positioning of the patios that was meant to produce a shadowless ambience inside and this continuous luminous atmosphere. And then the whole surface is supposed to subsume the function of a seat and become a giant sofa. Right? So that means the management of threshold operates actually on a number of different levels: distributional, acoustic, luminous, performative, and so on and so forth. That's where Marc Fauchot argues the contribution lies mainly. And then secondly, in terms of the more ambitious part of the agenda, which of course fewer authors were capable to kind of hint at, but nonetheless some did, I think. For example, Stan says about Mancini Tuñon's Musac building in Spain, the project's accomplishment is not so much to resolve contradictions or make didactic statements as it is to suspend and dissolve apparent oppositions. So if you take that last bit, right, to suspend and dissolve apparent oppositions, and then abstract it away from the reading, it turns out that that resonates with realities, situations, and discursive problems outside of architecture. Right? So it is especially if you elaborate on it and turn it into something more than just a statement, but actually more of a theoretical framework, would be one that was born into the reading of a building and then abstracted to become relevant to fields outside of architecture. Second, the other text that you guys read for today, Etienne Santiago from Harvard GSD on the typical suburban American house, he argues that the plan, especially of these houses, embodies a new understanding of space that relies on a novel way of thinking about how a set of things, so not only rooms, but actually also people, information, and objects, are organized, linked, and systematized. Right? So he calls this understanding of space super urban and argues that it challenges older ways of conceiving boundaries and connections between elements. So in other words, he's arguing that you can actually have an organizational model in architecture that could have epistemological consequences. That is to say, that could change actually our way of seeing the world or understanding the world outside of the building, or even provide a framework for seeing it in a particular way. Right? So again, born into a building and then become something else. Third, Amanda, who was here the other day, I understand, putting forward one of my favorite concepts here, architectural sameness. She argues, well, how can we talk about architectural sameness in architecture? She says that there has been a search of terms around this issue over the past 5 or 6 years, quotes, replicas, copies, allusions, parodies, etc., but we lack actually a framework in relation to which to distinguish between these related but nonetheless different. To me, what's more important, though, is to say that this term resonates with problems, for example, in photography, in art history, or all the way to metaphysics, for example, where they discuss and have been doing that for millennia, questions of identity and difference, for which something like architectural sameness could actually become directly relevant. Now, fourth, Alexandra Bugia from the AA, talking about OMA's Dubai Renaissance, she proposes the idea of iconolatry as opposed to iconicity, and argues that this building is basically an absolute exterior, which means it's capable of absorbing any meaning and then in turn project any meaning, right? Which is different from, let's say, the Gherkin in London, which has a more limited or narrower set of semantic associations that you can sort of invoke when analyzing it in terms of meaning, right? So, in other words, iconolatry would be when the building's very condition as an icon is determined by its by its unstable semantic identity, right? Its capacity to absorb and project any meaning. She argues that this is a condition of 21st century capitalism, specifically because of the obsession with images and their rapid proliferation tends to generate models which lack a clear semantic anchor, right? Which basically become these unstable entities. Now, for folks interested in questions of meaning and representation, not as in graphic representation, but as in semantic, in the semantic sense, and even political, this question of iconolatry could definitely be relevant. And then lastly, Andrew Benjamin, who's a philosopher, that's why there's no image there, he says that buildings are always two things at the same time, right? So on the one hand, they are the after effects of a network of relations that precede the conception and construction of the building, but at the same time, they are the embodiment of an internal network of relations which is purely disciplinary, communication, program, materials, etc. So he argues that we should think of the latter in relation to the former, and in fact, to try to reconceptualize the former. That is to say, to use the internal network of relations as a countermeasure to other the global, as he calls it, which is not to stand counter to the existing network of relations, but rather to reconceptualize it, to enter into a kind of attempt to redistribute that which precedes the conception and construction of the building. So in other words, building as effect, but also as effectuation. And just to end, I put up here some 60, I think, concepts that pertaining to architectural thinking come up in the book to try to talk about the double expansion that I think occurs, or at least that was our attempt here. On the one hand, that if you look closely enough, it turns out that architectural thinking is extremely sophisticated, extremely nuanced, extremely complex. Right? It's not a matter of spatial thinking in some kind of generic way, which is the way it gets sometimes downgraded when you discuss it with people in other fields, right? If you look closely enough, as in, through a microscope, there's like an entire world out there. So that's the first type of expansion, a kind of implosion, expansion from within. Then the second type, which is kind of into out, is to say, actually, you can pick out one or two or three, and then begin to consider the relationships between those terms with a view to generate a system of thought that could potentially alter, again, domains outside of architecture. And that was exactly the case for those of you who are familiar with those movements and concepts. In the case of structuralism, out of design, that's exactly what happened. Or in terms of, you think of Freudian psychoanalysis and the study of the human psyche. That's exactly what happened there. So to end with just by showing you some of the book pages, to say that this double expansion, an attempt to basically grow architecture's discursive capacities from within to kind of ignite its potential to expand its limits and audiences, is exactly the way in which we believe that this project could bridge the gap between studio, culture, practice on the one hand, and history theory on the one hand, which was at the top of our agenda since the beginning. And that for that to happen, as Dora Epstein-Jones identified in the book on the American side, and Philip Ursprung in the European side, actually the current history theory project would have to be expanded as opposed to contracted. Right? It sounds like focusing on the building implies a kind of narrowing down. But actually, it's kind of the opposite, which is what I've tried to argue throughout the presentation. And on that somewhat paradoxical note, I'm going to leave you there with Bernard's learner hall. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think it would be a lot of fun to get deep into the subject matter of the book, but I thought that maybe it would help to start with a broad question, maybe a question that could provide some context for the argument that you're engaging in. I absolutely agree, and I think anyone is familiar here, whether you come from practice or academia or now in the school, with this phenomenon of architects looking beyond the discipline and beyond the profession into other fields. I wonder if you could speak to what you think is the source of this compulsion, even given the enormous demands that professionals, practitioners, historians, theorists have within the field itself to go beyond the field. And you talked a little bit about it in your presentation, but what is the problem there?
Yeah, well, so that's going to be speculating a lot, I think. But perhaps I can see two reasons for that. I mean, one is to say that in the humanities, architecture is actually a younger discipline, right? When compared to philosophy, when compared to art history, when compared to, if you go to the social sciences, sociology, and so on and so forth. Basically, we were part of art history. So of course, we had a Vitruvius, we had a Durand, we had a few folks who actually did a lot for architectural history and theory before. But the way we understand those fields in the humanities today is we're actually a younger discipline, right? 40 and 50 years. So that means that basically by now we, seem to be like coming of age in a way relative to those. So it is perhaps because we were young, didn't have enough muscle to quote unquote compete. Compete is a wrong term, but to kind of feel that we were kind of on a par with other fields that historians and theorists have, tend to look at other domains which they may have felt were more developed, deeper, sophisticated, you name it. Now, regardless of that, I think there might be a second dynamic which has to do with the fact that there's something about focusing on the building or focusing on design, which for people who have, read a lot, that are very cultivated and engaged with focusing on the field, just doesn't seem enough, basically, right? I mean, it seems like a reductive way of approaching the problem of making a contribution to knowledge in a discursive sense. So one of the arguments that I'm trying to make here is actually, I get that, right? I get that the building is perhaps just one reality, in a field of many others, which we have to engage, of course, in terms of the built environment and elsewhere. But at the same time, if you apply this microscope logic, right? If you look closely enough, there is a lot there too that we have to, I think, unveil and as historians and theorists. So I think it's somewhere in the combination of those two reasons is probably why, this tendency to go outside.
Okay, thank you, Jose, for a great presentation and a great project. Particularly the ambition, I think, is really incredible, no? To attempt to make sense of the relation of theory and practice. I think it's really a strong vector of the project, which is a really important one. In a way, it's you could argue it's the central vector of architecture as a discipline. is that constant tension between theory and practice, and the way that you frame it around the building, and in particular through an argument that tries to acknowledge the dead end of autonomy, but still keep the building as, in a way, like you say, an object of knowledge, is a really provocative claim, because usually those things do get lumped together. And so I appreciated the distinction between autonomy and specificity. I thought that was really useful, and it opens up a way to navigate through. So I guess my questions are maybe two. One would be, in a way, to challenge the framework of, in a way, the historization that you make of the importation of theories into architecture, because I think you, and it might have just been because you were speaking very short, but you point to the 60s as a moment, no? And I guess for me, the importation and export between, in a way, the import-export model is my problem. Because I feel like that, as a rubric, sets up a kind of implicit boundary that is always there. That we can date to 1960, or we could date to the early 19th century, or we could date to Vitruvius, you know. But in a sense, the keeping of the boundary, whether it's importing or exporting, whether we're buying more than we're selling, or we're selling more than we're buying, it does, to me, it does reify architecture as a universal thing. And I don't actually think it is a universal thing. It's a highly historical thing. And the fact that you had to point to the 60s to point to a moment of when the importation started happening is an example of the fact that it's a historically constructed condition. You know, and then I think that the importation, if we take that model, could be taken to exist beforehand. So I just want to, in a way, call out the constructedness of that opposition as something that is not. It's not something we can do away with. I think it's the core of what architecture is, that problem. And so that's one set of questions that has to do with keeping the model of in a way, the modernist division of labor, the bourgeois liberal model of partition of professional labor in society, which really is systematized in the 19th century, and universalizing that. I don't think that we could do that. I think that's a problem. So that's one question, and obviously Foucault is the master thinker of that, through, you know, in books like The Order of Things. Basically, the distribution of discourses and disciplines is a function of history. It's a function of power relations. That question that, in a way, you, I'm not saying that I think that you wouldn't negate that, but I think we can't dismiss that. I don't think we're done with that. You know, I think that I like the call to specificity, but I do think that the call to specificity needs to include that problem, needs to wrestle with it. It's not going to be solved by importing a different theory just like that, right? But it does need to be considered. So that's one element to do with disciplinary formations and the question of power and history. And the other question concerns the building itself. I really like the idea of thinking materially and thinking very specifically, but to me there's a real question, and maybe we can take the building as from a purely functional perspective. It provides a context we can all relate to. It's kind of practical in that way. It could become a useful category simply because of it's so prevalent, right? The problem I find with making it a master category is that I really feel like we're called to, by our very moment, in a way, historically, to think in bigger scales. Whether we have the disciplinary tools to do that or not is a really important question, you know. I think that's why we're seeing a lot of work on infrastructure emerging. I think the problem of climate change forces us to think at multiple scales at once. It forces us to think about the building not as an object, which I think that a lot of your authors already open up, right? But in terms of different time scales, you know, whether it's the Anthropocene or whether it's the life cycle or whether it's the question of change and the question of development. So there's definitely a kind of question of whether the building is whether it can do that work, you know. What do you think about that?
Okay, so first question, not sure I understood completely the question, but what I can say is that yes, there was important before the 60s for sure, right? But I do think, and this has been actually historicized by other people before, there's a moment in the late 60s where, for a number of reasons, the role of theory in constructing architecture's disciplinary culture increased drastically, right, compared to previous times. That means that the nature, even though there was importation before, the change in degree was so drastic that it actually changed the nature of the discipline, right? That's why they need to specifically identify that moment, right? Which was all about, as you say, actually very well, I think, historicize this discursive sequence, right? It's supposed to just, you know, describe the current moment, right? Which, you know, in 4,000 words you can only do so much, but I tried my best at that. So that's one thing. Then, in terms of scales, I cannot agree more, actually. Yeah. Now, two things to that. I think there are different terms for those different objects. So, I mean, simply, you talk about the city, you can talk about urbanism, you can talk about urban thinking, which is definitely related to architecture, but at the same time has a number of specific features to it, we could say. With climate change, you can talk about environmental studies, right? With infrastructure, maybe we don't have a term for that, or kind of stands in between, something to look into. But what I would say is that in terms of architectural knowledge, there might be a way where we can still reflect on all of those scales, whether separately or simultaneously, without losing our foot in our understanding of architectural thinking, right? The scale that comes from the object. Like, too often you see people who address those larger scale issues without necessarily any recourse to architectural thinking. And I wonder whether there's a way to bridge across those different scales without losing your foundation, right? So that's part of the, and that's not explicitly, actually, I take the blame for that. It's not explicitly put like that in the intro, but that would be part of the reason why, you know, it's going out into other fields also includes the ones you mentioned for sure. Huh?
I think we'll take some questions from the audience.
So you mentioned the building as. How did the other fields' infiltration into architecture help delineate architecture and also help form the definition of the building? So we have other fields that have been kind of incorporated into architecture, but how did that impact the self-definition of architecture or the building?
How did importing from other fields help define the building?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good question, right? Because I think to what degree importing those external concepts redefined the building versus redefine the reading of a building, or what you do in the building or how you perceive it, right? Which is a different regime of understanding, right? So I have in mind one of the latest examples, for example, Michael Hayes' Architecture's Desire, right? Which is an attempt to read buildings through psychoanalysis, for example, right? That's one such case, right? Does he really redefine the building itself in terms of the, for example, the proposition that I shared with you guys? Or rather, does it allow you to look at it from a different perspective, which strictly speaking is a different thing, right? It's a different thing. Like, you may have an apple in front of you, the apple is still an apple, right? But if you read a particular reading of the apple, that might shift your understanding of the apple, even if the apple remains as such, right? So I think those are different projects, right? To try to actually refine the thing, let's say, versus take a stab at a different reading through an external field. Right? So my guess is that this tendency to import has done more in terms of these alternative readings rather than the actual redefinition of the thing itself, if you allow such a term, right? Which is complicated already, but for the purpose of this, we can allow it, right?
I personally admire your speech very much because I myself also believe in the power of architecture. And I understand that you see building as a combination of form, program, and a container of life, which you wish to put influence also to other disciplines. So I totally agree with that. Architect is creating a lifestyle that is influencing human activities. Okay, so the question is, if this new lifestyle and human activities, which is influenced by architects, are originated in architecture thinking, which you rejected the influences from other disciplines, wouldn't it become just an illusion that lies in the ivory tower of architects, regardless of the variety of the world, of the other disciplines?
No. Well, thank you for the question, but I did say a few times that this is not about a retreat to a kind of disciplinary autonomy, actually, on the contrary, right? This is about exploiting the pores through which architecture is connected to experiences and to domains of knowledge and practice outside of architecture without losing our the knowledge of our own specificity, basically. So the project would entail, a second, third phase, would entail to actually explore those, right? I mean, in that sense, I think this project is actually not a project, it's just the proposal for a project, rather. It's not complete in any way, right? So it would be about exploring how exactly those bridges could be constructed. I gave 5 examples, and I think those are more like hints at, something like more complete projects, but in no way actually complete projects. So yeah.
I did notice that you mentioned that what you describe is not an autonomy for a few times, but that's basically what I'm thinking about. That maybe because this influence is originated in not in variety, but you wish to create variety. So this doesn't match. The thing that you wish to achieve, the influence to human activities, the new lifestyles that architectures are creating, the new variety that you are exploring, is rooted in autonomy.
Maybe you could describe again, Jose, how you differentiate the project of autonomy to this idea of specificity. You just spoke about it a little bit in the lecture, but maybe that's the crux of this question.
Well, I mean, as I said, right, I think I mentioned 3 main reasons why I don't think focusing on architectural thinking leads necessarily to autonomy, right? I mean, autonomy, the way it has come to our understanding, basically did imply a reduction to a kind of formal system that was meant to be universal, to apply outside of time, and so on and so forth, right? And as I said, I don't think architectural thinking is about form only, A. B, it's not about universals or timelessness, even though that's an option, right? And 3, as I'm saying now, it's architectural specificity, the kinds of things that basically set our discipline apart from others, is actually connected to those other fields, right? The fact that it's different doesn't mean that it's watertight, like sealed off from those. No, it's obviously connected to those, but it's just different, right? I mean, you can think about it in terms of, you like soccer, for example, right? Think about it in terms of the goalkeeper and the midfielder and the striker, right? So they're all playing a different game, right? It's like, the same game, right? It's like politics, ethics, religion, aesthetics, architecture. We're all playing the same game. And yet, everyone has a slightly different role within the game, right? So something like that. We're all connected, right? And yet we are differentiated. We're different, right? So that was the idea. Specific, but not autonomous, right?
Can I just tag along on that? So how would you historicize architectural thinking then? I mean, is that something that, because there's the way I understand it is, one dimension of that is actually just to do with creativity, with the training of a certain creative impulse that architects have, which it's a more of a kind of embodied knowledge, let's say, It's less theoretical in the sense of reading books and more about exploring materials, getting good at drawing, getting good at even experiencing things a certain way, which is not necessarily reading.
Yeah.
But very quickly you get into a chicken and egg problem, because even to do those things, there are discourses of how to do those things. So in a way, like bracketing off architectural thinking itself from discourses, theoretical discourses, explanatory frameworks, even just cultures, right? Different cultures that do things in different ways. Like the topic of architectural thinking in itself is a very interesting one. It's a very complex, rich one.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it wasn't our intention to bracket it off, really, right? But to just not define it, but basically emphasize that it is different, right? That it has a number of specificities that make it different from other fields. It's interesting if you talk to people who are doing PhDs in politics or professors in comparative literature or professors in metaphysics, right? I've talked to a few of them after starting the project, and actually Dora kind of points to that in the essay. They don't seem to have the same kind of identity problem, right? Like many of them, right? For some reason, we keep coming back to it. I don't know if that goes all the way back to your first question, actually, right? In terms of why is that the case, right? Is that because we are a younger discipline, perhaps? Right? That's like a different project, to kind of figure that out. I don't know exactly. But in terms of the historicizing that, yes, of course, there is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? If you consider architectural thinking as partaking both in the making of architecture, right, design, and as itself a discursive field, it seems that they kind of came hand in hand for a while, but then there was this drastic, I think, and again, this is something that some people have written about before, this drastic development of the discursive side over the second half of the 20th century, right? So you have to begin to think in terms of degrees, right? Like it's not the same to, I don't know if I can give a simple example, everything is going to kind of sound reductive here, but it's not the same to just give a simple statement, a descriptive statement about a table, for example, which already has a certain theoretical or even historical import or chart to it, versus develop an entire theory, right? I mean, there's a kind of difference in degree that makes it a different thing, right? So same with architectural thinking. It's not the same to say, in prehistoric times or, I don't know, whenever, in the 12th century, so I was like putting one stone on top of another. I mean, there's kind of already a discursive thing going on there for sure, right? But compared to, what we can do today, given our, a lot of people talk about digital tools. Wow, they're so sophisticated today, the kinds of things we can do. Same is true for intellectual tools, right? The kinds of intellectual tools that have come to our disposal today are incredibly sophisticated as well. So the kinds of things we can do today, we couldn't 50 years ago, right? So that's why the issue of degree comes into play. It describes a different kind of practice.
Thank you for your speech. And I'd like to ask about, actually, you make a difference between the estranging internalization and the discursive category. Actually, you emphasize a lot about architecture's role in in its influence to other disciplines about whether it's an importer or exporter, right? So actually, I want to ask about, is it really important to tell clearly about who is the importer or who is the exporter when we talk about the interdisciplinary questions? Because here the trend of the world is to make things combine together, integrate together. So if we just emphasize so much about how architecture can offer to other categories, will it be very pitiful that we ignore the rich resources from other disciplines? Okay, thank you.
That's a good question, yeah. Goes to the core of the project in a way. I think, and to the issue of identity crisis, right? I think basically at bottom, what we were trying to do is to grow architecture's importance on the map of the humanities, and if possible, even beyond, right? So why is it important that we tend to import more so than export? Because that means that we feel a certain lack that causes our need for fill the void by importing, right? So the idea is to let's grow it, right? I mean, let's grow it from within to make it on a par with other fields, right? The same way other fields do, right? Without necessarily undercutting the relationship with those other fields, right? So it is because of that. That basically goes right to the main motivation here. Probably, right? To grow the importance of architectural thinking as a discipline in history and theory, right? So that's why. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense, but do you think that maybe it's because just as you mentioned that architecture is quite a younger discipline, and so do you think maybe there's possibility that architecture actually cannot offer very much to other disciplines? Because I think architecture is quite a special discipline in our society, kind of like that. It's not like philosophy or others. Actually, architecture naturally is a very kind of like a discipline based on practice and theory. They are combined. But something like philosophy is not like that. So, sorry.
You're not very optimistic about this. No, yeah, okay, I take your point. Look, I am more optimistic about that, right? And ambitious also, right? And I think I cannot answer that question, really, to be honest, unless I could devote the next 10 or 15 years, maybe 20 years, to develop projects that actually would prove that wrong, basically. So to develop a corpus of work in the discursive domain that could, show you how architecture actually does have the power to become potent, right, in the humanities, right? It's very hard to measure that historically. Actually, I don't know how would even, how one have the tools to measure that, but I do think that is possible. And don't forget that the relationship, and this is something that Bernard says all the time, there is a very tight relationship, since you mentioned philosophy, between philosophy and architecture. Right? He says that basically, at bottom, the two disciplines are concerned themselves with the creation of concepts. Right? It's just that philosophy tends to develop them discursively, and architecture tends to develop them materially in the empirical world. Right? But at bottom, it's the same. Right? So then, why not think that we could, of course, that's impossible in the short term, right? But we could try to do our best, right? And grow our theoretical and historical presence and power, right? By working on it. But that's impossible to answer.
Can
Thank
I?
you very much for your talk. I just have a quick question on the role of technology in your project. Because it seems to me like the category of technology could possibly be something that threatens the integrity of the category of building. So I guess my question is, like, excuse me, how do you understand technology in this project? How do you define it, and kind of what type of work does it do within your framework?
Yeah. Sure. Look, no technology, no building, for sure. Which is why when I was talking about architectural thinking, one of the 4 things I mentioned, I think I mentioned ontology, logic, phenomenology, and technology, for sure. Something as simple as sitting in front of the screen in an office and drawing a section that assumes the existence of technology and actually needs it, because there's no way that section is going to get built if it was not for technology, right? So that's for sure. So I think that's probably the only thing I can say that is built into the definition of architectural thinking, unlike other domains, right? Unlike other practices. I think technology is one of those 4 or 5 that are built into the very action of enacting architectural thinking, for sure.
Can I ask a question? Okay. Thanks. Thank you very much for your lecture. I may have a very simple question. Through which way or through which medium do you think is the best possibility that our architectural thinking could be conveyed to other fields? That maybe it was the lecture or the communications between other fields experts with architects, or maybe other ways. Because architecture is a very common thing in our everyday life. I mean, other fields experts may have the possibility to come to visit the architecture by themselves, and could it be possible that they may have different understanding of architecture with what they have received from through other ways? Yeah.
Yeah, good. Yes, so that's one of the things that I think we're lacking actually in schools of architecture. Long-term engagement with experts in other fields, right? Not only occasional panel discussions events or occasional conferences, no. Long-term projects with experts in other fields, with experts in politics, with experts in philosophy, with experts in aesthetics, with experts in technology, right? So that we can come into conversation with them and share that which we know the most about, supposedly, with that which they know the most about, supposedly, too, right? And it's only, that way that we can perhaps aspire to, to create these more, profound, long-lasting conversations, links between architecture specificity and other fields specificity, as opposed to someone, which is also necessary because we have to train our understanding of those other fields. But that is different from someone in architecture, for example, reading a lot about a certain other domain and then trying to, in a way, become an expert at that domain, exiting altogether architecture and writing squarely within that other domain. That's different from actually engaging a person in that other domain, say politics, for example, and then construct the project together, right? That's a different thing. I would go for the latter more so than the former. And I would say that the former now is more common than the latter. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. The first question is following the girls' the question. Can I simply conclude that why you are doing this is that you want to say something for the young bird discipline, the architecture, analyze by this series of case studies and then export its concept or new knowledge to other domains? I just guess the potential motivation.
What I do? Yeah. I'm trying to think of something that I haven't yet said, perhaps, so as to not repeat myself. Okay, so for example, one effect of this could be not only long-term projects with people in other fields, but also a different kind of conversation even within the School of Architecture, for example, where we engage this as, the focus of our attention, for example, right? The fact that architectural thinking has a lot of potential as a form of knowledge. So how to delve deeper into that, how to work on it, how to work through it, and how to establish links between that, discursively in the case of seminars, but also in terms of design in the case of studio, so as to engage fields outside of architecture, for example. In other words, it could have an impact also in terms of not entire academic structure, but specific projects within a school. Right? So it could become, if it has already been symposia, conferences, books, etc., it could become also a pedagogical enterprise as well.
Would the just to tag on, how do you measure it? I mean, it's difficult, no, it's impossible. But how would you? Do you think the result of a more productive relationship in that way would be just better buildings, or would it be better books about architecture, or is it both? Is it better citizens? Is it? I mean, what? How
yeah. As much as possible, like all of the above is possible. No, I mean, I'll try to narrow it down, yeah. I mean, it's of course very difficult, but I think just by virtue of how hard it is to be a good architect, to be a great architect possibly, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to be a good thinker or a great thinker, you tend to find those as separate entities, separate people and separate projects, right? So I'm generalizing, obviously, but I mean, one can only speak about general patterns. I mean, there are exceptions, but the kind of dominant pattern is that you find either great projects in terms of design or great pieces of discourse, right, in terms of engaging other fields. I mean, would it be possible to do both, right? To charge with the same intensity both sides of the equation within the same project, right? I guess that would be one goal, right? Now that's easier said than done, obviously, but that would be the pursuit.
And the second question is, what the difference between the building and the architecture? I mean, you simply you maybe imply that the building is more physical, but is there any possibility to connect theory to theory?
Okay, so on this one, I do disagree a bit with Bernard, right? Because Bernard will tell you that not all buildings are architecture. So he famously gives the example of the bicycle shed that could actually be architecture if it embodies a concept, versus a Gothic cathedral that perhaps is not architecture, right? I actually do disagree on the grounds that I think just by virtue of buildings being architecture's object of study, they actually belong to different regimes of understanding, if that makes sense. Right? Architecture is a discipline whose object is a building or the building. Right? They are on two different layers. Right? If you begin to say that some buildings are architecture versus others, you're actually bringing the two levels together to the same domain and actually providing an idiosyncratic way of distinguishing, conceptual buildings versus conceptual architecture versus non-conceptual buildings, right? So insofar as buildings are, in my view, architecture's object of study, they belong to different layers of discourse, if that makes sense, right? So a building is not architecture or more or less architecture, it's just connected to architecture as a discipline, as its object, right?
Or maybe the physical one is more easily to be connected to other domains. I just guess.
The physical building more connected to other domains versus the non-physical object, you mean, as an object of study? Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I have to think about that one. I'm running out of energy.
You have a question, Addison?
Only if there's not a student with a hand up. So to return to these thorny questions of autonomy and specificity and so on, I think it's a super interesting project. I think, given, as you said, this is still a thing in progress and evolving, and right now the kind of acid test we have are the texts produced under the under the aegis, which are both interesting texts, the ones we got to read. The Penelope Dean's very fine, what I would call a formal and architectural disciplinary analysis of the building. It's a really great reading. But then Etienne Santiago's discussion of the suburban houses, which I think opens with this rather striking delimitation of the field by referring to non-architectural issues, all of which strike me as profoundly architectural, e.g. financial conditions, racial segregation, energy expenditure, etc. That's not your framework, but it's coming out of this project, and I think it loops me back around to some of the statements in your introduction about such and such topic could be architectural, but only if a building is here, that architecture, but only if, which is a fine proposition. But I wonder, what is it about disciplinary specificity that means the building is what makes it disciplinary specificity? And to hash that out another way, Reinhold Martin, a scholar who, of course, you know, who works fantastically on buildings in order to discuss lots of other things, such as the real estate market and energy and so on, but through very, very close readings of buildings that I think would slot in very well here, tells us here in the program, the PhD program, that what interdisciplinarity is you visit a different library. You go to their library and you have to deal with their books and the way that they organize their knowledge. There's lots of stuff in Avery Library that's not the building, but is clearly part of the corpus of architecture. So what is it to you that means that to be specific to architecture, which I do think is a thoughtful thing, if we're going to be architecture people, we should know what that is. Why is it the building? And I think several of the other questions sort of test this. I mean, the question of why is the physical building for the last 25 years crucial rather than, say, an unbuilt project or a contract document or the sale of the property, or all sorts of other things that seem to me essential to the building code, and so on and so forth. What is it that makes the building the center of the field? Couldn't there be 10 centers of the field, basically?
Yeah,
Why does it have to be one thing?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, there may have been a misunderstanding there. Well, I mean, first of all, I didn't ask the authors to focus on build projects. Actually, I said unbuilt or built, right? So that was part of the equation, right? And then second, as I explained in the presentation, all of those things you mentioned, buildings contract, building code, all of those things, you know, fall squarely in architectural thinking, right? The building is there, actually. Buildings code is a building's code, right? The building's contract is a contract as well. Technology relates to building, right? I mean, as I said, basically what happens is that the building appears whether in the foreground or in the background. It just, on some level, is there, right? Otherwise, your work will fall squarely or more precisely in a different field, even if it's connected to architecture in some way, right? But all of those examples you mentioned, actually every single one of them, as well as much of Reinhold's work, not all of it, but most of it, the building is there, right? It's not the focus as in the physical object. I take your point, but the building is there in an intermediate layer, or it's in the background, or it's there too. No? So that's totally fine.
So who are these people for whom it's it's in the back? It's not in the background even, right? Apparently for somebody it's neither in the foreground or the background, or there wouldn't be a necessary project here, right? Like who are the bad guys? Sorry, that's probably unfair to ask you to name names, but I was having a hard time figuring, like, because there's so many great groups of contemporary scholars doing really interesting work, and I don't want to assume you're trying to kick them out, right? Because that would not be an interesting project. And the person defining a list of non-architectural topics is kicking them out.
No, as I say, when I get that question, this project doesn't want to be oppositional in any way, right? I mean, just to strengthen a particular way of doing things, which I think has been slightly underplayed, actually. That's part of the argument. But it doesn't go against anybody, it's not oppositional. I welcome conversations with everybody who's doing other stuff, like no hard feelings.
What a relief.
Hi, I had a question concerning reaching out to other fields, whether it's on a long term, not only through lectures or through books, do you think that it can be through providing a certain solution to architecture? For example, when we talk about art and seeing a piece of art, we have to go to a museum. So here the role of an architect is important, and ecology, we think of an ecological building. So when, for example, it comes to politics, should architecture provide a solution to change the way politics works?
I mean, to speak of solutions is a little bit tricky, right? Can architecture provide solutions? I mean, I guess in some cases it can provide solutions to certain things. I mean, I hesitate how to answer that. I mean, I tend to think. I mean, the more. I mean, I think that the tendency is that the more you are embedded within a particular field, the more agency you're going to have over that particular field, right? And that is the reason why certain people have pursued certain careers versus others, right? So we have to talk about politics in architecture, for example. I am absolutely convinced about that. Now, at the same time, are we going to have the same agency over politics, which is not our field, strictly speaking? We are related to that, right? But it's strictly speaking not our field. As a politician, as someone actually in power, someone actually making decisions and changing people's lives, as someone who's a community organizer, someone who's a humanitarian worker, we can do a lot of stuff there for sure. But going back to the issue of degree, intensity, is it the same type of agency as someone who is actually embedded in the crust of it? I'm not sure, right? We should try our best, right? But at the same time acknowledge that it's probably not the same, right? There's a percentage issue there, no? In terms of that agency, I think.
Can I push back a little bit?
Yeah.
Because so the problem is that the political sphere and the architectural sphere, they're not closed, right? And they're not universal. They're constantly changing. And if I can import a bit of Jacques Rancière, the whole point of politics is that it's a sphere that's constantly in contention, right? And that's what makes it political, is that you can have people that are not qualified, like architects or like immigrants or whatever, and claim that actually what you're talking about, I have a point that I want to make about it, and in my not being qualified but speaking about it, I'm politicizing it. So it's a process kind of model, right? And so it strikes me that, in a way, like, in fact, the focus on the building could be really political. You know, I mean, there's nothing that prevents it from being political in a really extreme way, right? And so, I suppose. I think that you can follow the framework that you're suggesting and do the politics or anything else. I just think that there's no essential boundary there. That these things are really. It's all about, like you said, it's all about a question of intensity and ways of doing. No?
Yeah. No. I mean, I completely agree with that. I mean, let me put it out differently. I don't think there has ever been an architectural historian writing about politics who has managed to be so influential worldwide in terms of large economic and political forces as someone like Margaret Thatcher or someone like Ronald Reagan, right? So that's what I'm saying, right? We do have to, as you're saying, right? We do have to pursue that, but at the same time acknowledge, the difference in terms of the type of agency that we can exert over that, which, as I was kind of suggesting to her, has actually driven some people to change fields, to say, no, I want to increase my agency. I'm going to change. Like, I mean, there are some, Obama is an example, for example. Right? Went from community organizer, got disappointed because he was not really affecting the kind of change he wanted to affect, and then proceeded up the ladder, right? To try to affect as much change as possible, right? In communities, in people, right? So that's a different type of thing. Right? So yes, let's try as much as we can, but at the same time, acknowledge that there are steps up the ladder. Right?
This is going to be a slightly tangent question. Understanding that your idea of interdisciplinary specificity was salient in your proposal, that you said it's not even a project yet, it's an ongoing proposal. I was wondering, since we all know that you teach at GSAPP, is this something that you plan to implement into your studio teaching, maybe in the future, or has it already started?
So to add to her question, within our own program, you get a lot of students. For example, my housing partner had a psychology background. I have a law background. And we have so many students already here who have backgrounds in different fields. I have another finance. I'm just ticking a few off my head, but we have mathematics and like complete range of fields already within the school. Like she suggested, how can we bring, or say maximize on that potential within the school? Or could we? Or are we?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot stress enough, I've had the best conversations along those lines with some of my students, and I'm referring to the ones without an architectural background, people with a background in mathematics, in psychology. They actually ask me very often, so I mean, how do I go about this thinking process? Because I actually tend to do things a particular way or go about a particular problem this way, but I'm not sure actually this is like, is it going to get me far enough? So we have these types of conversation often. Now, in the space of a semester, so far, I've been focusing more on trying to grow discipline from within, because so far I've seen that was the best way to actually teach them the design part, right? Now, depending on the studio that I'll teach in the future, that will probably shift to also emphasize the second part, which, as I said a few times, is the more ambitious one. It's harder, right? But for sure, I think maybe it can be tried in the space of a semester, definitely in the space of a year, for sure, where you could actually devote one semester for one half of the problem and then, or half of the strategy, and then the other semester for the other half of the strategy. And that's when a previous background in a different field is going to be extremely helpful, right? Not only that, but also the fact that conversations among these different fields are actually taking place in many seminars actually here in a school and elsewhere on campus where students are actually engaged. So for sure, if strategized properly and efficiently also, right? So that time is managed smartly without losing a foot on design, I think it's doable. In the space of a semester, can be a little hard, but it can definitely be tried, especially in upper studios. Advanced studios. Yeah.
I'll go for a question actually. I think it's my third question. I should not preface by saying I don't ask questions because I already have. I think. To start with, I really appreciated the presentation. It's been a while since I've seen a presentation based on the articulation of propositions that actually put emphasis on what I think the project is very strong about, which is sort of to define. It's a sort of definitional book. And in that respect, the sort of quest of define a number of propositions regarding architectural thinking, I think it's like it's interesting also because it's a rough format where you're in fact dealing with a number of issues. Following Addison's question, I would also share, I think it was implicit in your question, that the project is more polemical than you would be willing to admit. That there are clearly bad guys in the book, or there are enemies.
Enrique can ask this.
Yeah, but I think there's a sort of an ability in the project of basically not only advancing the project in such a way that it doesn't become a dialectical, Oedipal project, but that even you've actually brought in some of the people who would naturally be the enemies of your project. So I think it's, which is an interesting knowledge of architecture, of how to deal with contradictions, which is, anyway, but the question I have is not regarding the sort of implicit polemics that I think the project has, because it's definitional, and therefore there could be a number of people who would immediately react to it. Because as we were discussing minutes ago, I think the alternative title to your conference book could have been, what on earth happened to architectural theory? Or why did theory abandon building? Or why did it rarify, and so on. But the question I have is basically your position on interdisciplinarity. At some point, I think the project would seem to claim that it is really about reasserting architectural thinking, and you would imagine that the sort of critique of the way in which a certain architectural thinking has been diluted by excessive importation. But then by the same token, the project ends with a sort of potential and optimistic note about the fact that as architects we could potentially export. So the question is basically, what is your position on interdisciplinarity? Is it to some extent the sort of the very reason why your project exists, or is it something that your project would try to advocate or try to critique?
Definitely advocate, but in this very particular way that I've been trying to describe throughout the evening today, which is without losing an anchor on architectural thinking. So basically the problem became relatively early on in the project how to engage interdisciplinarity in a way that, without leaving architectural thinking behind, which I think is the case sometimes in architecture. So that's the kind of interdisciplinarity that I would be interested in. Engaging other fields by bringing along our specifically powerful knowledge and sensibility about architectural thinking. And how to do that, I think, is a challenge. I think, again, more often than not, one sees the two extremes of that gradient. So other people who do engage a lot with architectural thinking but forget about other stuff, or vice versa. People who aspire to a certain interdisciplinarity, but the kind of architectural thinking they bring to the table is relatively, or actually rather limited, or just on the scale of this spatial thinking that one hears very often as a kind of cover-up for just, or not cover-up, but kind of marker of just a few of the characteristics or concepts of architectural thinking versus its entire depth, right? As I was saying, it's a lot there. No, it's not just a few things. So yeah, definitely. I mean, that was one of the core problems that we tried to deal with from the beginning. Yeah, for sure.
Thank you for your presentation. And my biggest question is also, how can architecture thinking be exported to other fields? And actually, I think I have some clues from your essay. And quoted from your essay, that is exactly how architecture could become substantial, more germane, even beyond the humanities, in fields like computer science and the culture of Silicon Valley, which already display an inclination to use architectural terms. And actually, there is another sentence in the essays of the super urban house. Just like the developing structure of the World Wide Web, the super urban privileges organizational structures with greater complexity. And my question is that I found, because you say that architecture is a young disciplinary, so it's very difficult to insert or export its own term into the older disciplinary like philosophy or something. So I think that, are you trying to exporting architectural thinking into even younger disciplinary like computer science or something else? That's my question.
Very good.
And actually, I know there is actually some architectural terms in the computer science, like information architects, like architectural engineers. They are trying to use some terms from architecture to describe the structure of the information system. So that's my question. Maybe for some new technology or new fields disciplinary, there will be something that architectural terms can be used.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Both, right? Both for younger disciplines. I mean, that's a very sort of precise, interesting distinction you're making there. But the goal will be both for younger disciplines and older disciplines, right? Imagine a conference or, again, a long-term project joined with computer science folks where there are a number of terms thrown on the table which are common to both fields. They explain to us the way they understand it, right? Probably it won't be as profound and as deep as the way we understand it, let alone historical, right? And so then we come in and say, hey, actually, you know, there are many other implications to that. We can actually start a conversation about how these other nuances, these other aspects of that concept or that framework actually could be interesting to you. And by the way, maybe the way you understand it can also be interesting to us, right? Because you've brought to the table a different reading of this aspect or that feature. So that's how you can actually set up that conversation. And in the case of philosophy, for example, where there's some common language as well, same thing, right? The term architectonics actually appear in the making of philosophical theories actually from 17th century on, right? So let's engage with philosophers, for example. Actually, there was a time where architecture did that 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and discuss those common terms, for example, and see how that conversation can be developed, and so on and so forth. No? So ambitiously, you could actually aim for both younger and older disciplines.
Hi. Oh my God, I was so blown away by your presentation. No, thank you very much for presenting this project. I've heard a lot about it. I've heard a lot about the studio. So it's really wonderful to see this monumental effort coalesce and to provoke us in so many different directions. I have a rather crass question because I'm not terribly delicate sometimes or eloquent about how I string together an idea that's still rather inchoate. But I was so taken by that one slide you had where I can't quite remember, but there were 3 points on it. And it was kind of a layout of the book and said, first section is the building, second is critiques of the building, and then the third one I can't remember. But there was this fantastic ambiguity that was happening in the typography of that, actually, where every time there was the word the building, it was italicized as the title of your book. But then I wasn't quite clear on whether the building you meant to refer to the book itself each time and replace kind of the common noun, the building, with the title of the book. Like, was it critiques of the book or was it critiques of the building? And so it recalled for me in a way, I guess, the way that we all talk about Kleenex when we mean tissue, which is that the brand has become so powerful that in a way it can take over the object, the everyday object in a way. So how, I guess, in some ways it feels like the stake of this project is what is architecture? So that would be the stake of architecture, for architecture, is what is architecture? If that is the stake, I would be very worried for architecture. In part because, like many people, many of the students here, I've also come from outside of architecture. And the reason why I came into architecture surely was not to answer a rather closed, specific question about professionalization, unless in a historical sense, I think. So I came from studying music, and actually I started studying architecture through this class, through Metropolis. This was my first architecture class. So it's kind of fascinating to be going through these questions in this way, but it strikes me that that building itself is not a privileged arena for architecture at all. There's sociologists who talk about building. There are anthropologists who do, especially recently there's a spatial turn. So in some ways it's interesting to hear of an anxiety of architecture not exporting, so to speak, because it seems everyone wants to talk about architecture. At least that's my view, coming from outside the field. So how would this be a question? Branding. Insofar as this is a project of branding, are you saying that there is a way in which architecture, in order to be relevant, has to play this particular game? It's like, just for a second, remove the positive, negative connotation of branding, right? We live in a totalized capitalist society in a way. That can also be challenged. But is that what you're saying, is this is what we need to do in order to stay involved? And again, I apologize if that was really crass. I do admire the project, and I'm only responding very strongly to it because it's close to me autobiographically even.
Okay, so I understand. Well, there's a number of things there. Let's try to break it down into two questions, right? One, the italics thing. I think that's actually extremely perceptive. And definitely that perversion was there on my mind, for sure. I don't know if with some branding intentions, possibly, right? I wouldn't have deliberately described it to myself that way. I don't know if out of subconsciousness, perhaps, but I think that was part of the issue there, right? A combination of the building as the book's title and actually also a concept or a category of understanding collapsing together into a typographical gesture, let's say, right? That was there for sure. More unconsciously than consciously, perhaps, but it was there nevertheless, right? So that's one thing. Then the other thing is that for sure I know that in other fields they talk about buildings, right? In sociology, in art history, in politics, even in philosophy and aesthetics, for sure. That is different, however, from saying that architecture is actually exporting theoretical frameworks that were grown from within architecture. That's a different thing, right? It is one thing that they are talking about you versus you having produced a system of thought, basically, that has a capacity to become meaningfully relevant to fields outside of your own, right? That's a different problem. So I'm not sure that the latter has been the case very often or at all. The former is the case often. Now, because the way they talk about architectural topics is defined by a different purpose, usually, than the one we have from within architecture. At the end of the day, purposes define roles, right? And that's how you can actually even establish a framework for argumentation to begin with. They pursue a different set of questions usually than the ones we try to pursue. Or, to put it differently, even if that is the case, then part of the challenge or the interesting part is to kind of find zones of overlap, right? That goes back to one of the first slides about interdisciplinary processes being rooted in difference, so that we can, be exactly aware with accuracy of, what we are contributing to the conversation versus them. But it's a different set of purposes, typically, versus ours. No? But yeah, the italics thing is very good. No?
Do we have a final question? Well, I have a final question then. I described in my introduction this project as an ongoing research project. What course is it going to take next, do you think?
I'm not sure I have any more energy left to keep not today. Today I have energy to keep going, but in general, it was quite an effort that I enjoy for sure. But perhaps the next project could be about the city as opposed to the building, for example. Right? Like, can you ask a similar set of questions? Analogous, right? Never identical, never the same, but analogous to the ones that we were asking here about the building, right? Especially in the American context, where the relationship between urban design and architecture is of a particular kind, let's say, relative to the European context. Right? Maybe that could be a next project. No? Speaking of jumping the scale, for example.
Is there time for one? One quick one? Yeah. Just a quick one. Very curious, in a way it's different form of the last question. How does it take shape in your own work as a scholar? Because it hasn't come up, the fact that you're actually both an architect and also a scholar. So in many ways, probably this project is really personal to you and shapes how you're develop.
That's very good. Yes, I would see my PhD work as a specific project within this framework, if you will. This is describes a particular approach to the production of knowledge in architectural history and theory, and I would say that my quote-unquote scholarly work falls within this domain by being a particular one. So in that sense, I was sensing the two different scales between that and my scholarly work. So when I'm asked, well, is that your dissertation? How are they connected? Usually that's the answer I give. It's a different scale. This is the delineation of a domain of knowledge, and within it, you hopefully someday will find
Studying a
my
building?
dissertation.
Or the building?
No, I am engaged in architectural thinking, right? So there are a number of buildings involved, but they are not even case studies, right? I'm more interested in my dissertation's case to engage architectural thinking from a particular lens, which I don't think is relevant here. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it, but maybe in a different context, rather than specific case studies as buildings.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.